Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another Daily Maverick webinar, another bound to be insightful and important conversation. This evening, we're going a little bit off the beaten track of immediate contemporary politics. Last week, when I did a webinar, it was with the winner of the 2022 Nobel Peace Prize. Well, today we have, what is in my view, somebody who is one of the world's best historians, Adam Hochschild, coming to us from Maine in the United States, and somebody I'm very, very grateful has agreed to have this conversation. Good afternoon, United States time, Adam.
Well, good evening to you, Mark.
Thank you for being with us. Before we start our conversation, Adam, I just want to introduce the audience to you. I think many people will be familiar with your writing, but not everybody. So let me say that I think that you are one of the world's most renowned historians. You call yourself a public historian. You are the author, I think, of at least 11 books, essays, and major works of history. And some of those books include the fabulous King Leopold's Ghost, Bury the Chains, which I have a copy of here. Your very latest book, American Midnight, which was published in late 2022. I have read 6.5 of Adam's books, and I've always found them to be meticulously researched, beautifully written, inspiring stories of men and women, where a common theme is to tell the stories of people who have fought for justice and altered the course of history. Adam draws up an amazing cast, or draws upon an amazing cast, whether it's Thomas Clarkson in Bury the Chains, or W.E. Du Bois in American Midnight, or King Leopold in King Leopold's Ghost, or the American Communist, somebody I always admired, Jack Reed, John Reed, or Emma Goldstein, or I could go on, Sylvia Pankhurst, George Orwell. So, Adam, it is a very rare privilege to have you with us this evening and to be able to talk about your writings, to hear from you about history, how you choose your subjects, and what you think about the world in which we are currently living. So great. Before my first question, I also just want to say to people who are with us in the audience, feel free to chat. If you have any questions to Adam, put them in the Q&A, and I will do my best in the next hour to make sure that Adam answers them. So, Adam, let's get started. I have loved all of your books, but two of my favorite books, and I think it was the first two of your books that I came across, are both books about Africa. King Leopold's Ghost, which is about the struggle to overcome colonialism in the Belgian Congo and the horrors of colonialism in the Belgian Congo, and Bury the Chains, which is about the, you call them the rebels and the prophets in the fight to free an empire's slaves. Just to give people a sense of your writing and what you've written about, will you talk for a few minutes just about those two books and what they tell us? So over to you.
Okay, well, King Leopold's Ghost, for those who haven't read it, is the story of the colonization of what today is the Democratic Republic of Congo. And most people think of its colonial days as it being the Belgian Congo, which it was from 1908 to 1960. It was a Belgian colony. But from 1885 to 1908, it was the privately owned colony of one man King Leopold II of Belgium, who was an extremely brilliant, greedy, ambitious, unscrupulous man, an absolute genius at public relations, who wanted a colony. He had become king of Belgium in the middle of the 19th century at a time when it wasn't so much fun to be a king anymore because you had to share power with elected politicians, parliaments, and so on. He wanted somewhere where he could reign supreme, and so he wanted a colony. It was just the very beginning of the scramble for Africa. He hired the British explorer, Henry Morton Stanley, the man who found Livingstone, to basically stake out this vast territory in the middle of the continent for him. And he got all the major nations of the world, starting with the United States, to recognize it as his personal, privately owned possession. And during the 23 years that he owned it, he made a fortune from that territory, estimated at well over $1 billion in today's American dollars, primarily by setting up a forced labor system to gather wild rubber, which grew throughout the Central African rainforest and where there was a terrific demand for it. This caused a huge number of deaths. Rubber laborers were worked to death. People fled this forced labor regime deep into the rainforest where there was no food, no shelter. They died. And through the efforts of a combination of people, American and European missionaries who were eyewitnesses, some brave Africans who spoke out, and an extraordinary business executive turned journalist in England, Edmund Dean Morell, this became the major human rights scandal of the first decade of the 20th century. That's what King Leopold's Ghost is about.
Right. And after King Leopold's Ghost, which is also the story of people who in Belgium itself and in Europe took up the cudgels against King Leopold. After King Leopold's Ghost, you followed up with another story about Africa and slavery called Bury the Chains. Will you tell us about Bury the Chains? I think King Leopold's Ghost was your 5th book. Bury the Chains was your 6th book.
That's right.
What led you, your early interest in Africa and in struggles against colonialism and slavery?
Well, let me answer that question first, and then I'll come back to Bury the Chains. My connection to Africa is a quite personal one because, in a way, I was a direct beneficiary of colonialism. My father was an American business executive who worked all his life for a multinational mining company. During the time that I was growing up, most of the value of that company's holdings were shares of mines on the copper belt of what was then Northern Rhodesia. Today, it's Zambia. So my father made what may have been the mistake of taking me with him on a business trip to Africa when I was a teenager, and I began to realize that my university education and our comfortable life here in the United States was actually being paid for by the labor of African miners working far under the earth in hot, damp, often dangerous conditions. And that was my first introduction, really, to the way the world worked, to the enormous inequalities of wealth in it. And the subject of my relationship to that and my relationship to my father was the subject of my first book, which is called Half the Way Home, a memoir of father and son. But I think it was that experience that led me directly to the subjects I picked for later books. Did you want me to talk about Bury the Chains now specifically?
Just say a little. I'd like to, partly because it's my favorite book, but also because I want to encourage other people to read it, and I think it's very relevant today. It's about the power of individuals. You quote Margaret Mead at the beginning in the introduction to the book, saying her famous statement, "Never doubt the power of a handful of committed individuals to change the world." And that's what it's about, except it's set in the 18th century. Yeah, talk to us a little bit about Bury the Chains.
Well, here's how I got into that story. And like my journeys into other books, into stories that became other books, I thought I was looking for something different than what I actually found. I was fascinated by the figure of John Newton, whom many of you must know as one of the most prolific hymn writers in the English language. He wrote the hymn Amazing Grace, How Sweet the Name of Jesus Sounds, many other hymns that are still sung in Protestant churches today. But I had read that John Newton, previous to writing all those beautiful hymns, had been the captain of a slave ship and had made a number of slave voyages across the Atlantic. And like many people who hear that, I assumed that he must have repented that his involvement in this horrible thing, the slave trade, and then turned to hymn writing and becoming a very famous evangelical preacher after that repentance. But as I looked into his life, I realized that was not the case at all. He had his conversion to evangelical Christianity before he went into the slave trade, not after. He left the slave trade after making 4 transatlantic voyages, 3 of them as captain. He left the slave trade not for reasons of principle, but for medical reasons. He suffered a stroke and wanted to be sure that would not happen on shipboard, so he came ashore, became an evangelical preacher. And the next 30 years, he said nothing about slavery and the slave trade in his sermons, until one day a man I'd never heard of named Thomas Clarkson came to see him and said, Reverend Newton, we're organizing a committee against slavery and the slave trade, and you really should speak out. And Newton then wrote a short pamphlet, testified once or twice before Parliament, never mentioned the subject of slavery again for the remaining 20 years of his life, in public, at least anything that's recorded as a sermon or anything like that. So then I wondered, who was this fellow Clarkson? And maybe the story is him and this movement rather than Newton. And it was a remarkable new movement. It came together. Its first formal meeting was May 22nd, 1787, when 12 people came together in a Quaker bookstore and printing shop in London, and I've been to that site to try to imagine what it was like, to form themselves into a committee with the aim of ending first the slave trade and then slavery itself in the British Empire. They were extremely determined, and over the next year or two, they invented every technique that civil society organizations use today, that we're familiar with today. The political poster, and you've seen their poster. It's that image of a slave ship with hundreds of bodies packed into it like sardines. That was put together by a local committee it's a top-down diagram. You know the image I'm talking about. It was put together by a local committee in the town of Portsmouth of this anti-slavery committee. The committee invented the first political logo of a political organization. It showed a kneeling slave in chains, surrounded by the legend, "Am I not a man and a brother?" When women's anti-slavery societies got into the act a few years later, they changed the logo to a woman slave in chains, surrounded by the logo, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" They invented the very idea of a civil society organization with its headquarters in the national capital and affiliated offices in towns throughout the country, throughout Great Britain. All the things that we think of today as tools, like the consumer boycott, You know, in the big change in South Africa 30, 35 years ago, boycotts were tremendously important overseas. That was a tool that was used for the first time by these anti-slavery organizers in the 1790s, when there was when hundreds of thousands of people in Britain stopped eating slave-grown sugar. So this was the story, the movement that I tried to tell in Bury the Chains. An equally important and maybe even more important part of the movement, although harder to document, was the repeated slave revolts in the British West Indies. The last and largest of them happening in Jamaica in 1931-32, and I think it's no accident that 1831-32 that in 1833 the British Parliament finally ended slavery in the British Empire.
And it is such an inspiring story. And, you know, when I first read it, I don't know, a decade or so ago, it was precisely this realization that the tools of social justice activism had been invented several hundred years before and used effectively before electricity, before aeroplanes, before the internet, and all of that. And it told me that actually the power lies in people with conviction. And I loved the way that you described the Damascus conversion of Thomas Clarkson, who became one of the drivers of this movement. But his conversion, if I remember correctly, started when he had to write an essay on slavery. And as he began to study the experience of slavery, was moved, said he couldn't sleep at night because of what he was reading. And it was that led him into taking up this great cause. If am I remembering correctly, Adam?
You're remembering correctly. He was a divinity student at Cambridge University. And the big thing at Oxford and Cambridge in those days, one of those honors that stuck with you for the rest of your life, like winning a Rhodes Scholarship, was to win the annual Latin essay contest. So there was an annual Latin essay contest at Cambridge, and the vice chancellor at Cambridge was an unusually progressive guy who, quite rare for somebody in Britain at that time, actually had doubts about slavery, an institution which almost everybody there took for granted. And he posed this question for the Latin essay contest: is it justified to make slaves of people against their will? Clarkson entered the contest solely for the purpose of winning this very prestigious prize. He had no particular interest in slavery before then. And he was a very diligent researcher, sort of a born investigative journalist, read everything he could on the subject, enlisted his brother to help him. They discovered that a relative of the family had been in the shipping business, and they got access to records of slave ships. And he was absolutely appalled at what he found out. Writes very movingly in his memoirs, which is an extraordinary book, by the way, about how he left a candle burning in his room all night long at Cambridge. So in case a thought that occurred to him that would be useful in this essay, he could get up and write it down. So he wrote the essay in Latin. He read it. He won the prize. He read his essay aloud in Latin to an audience at Cambridge. And then, very proud of having won this prize, he got on the horse that he owned and set off for London to make his way in the world. Halfway to London, and he writes about this in his memoirs, he sat down by the side of the road, and he says, the thought came to me that somebody should do something about ending this terrible scourge. And he devoted the remaining 61 years of his life to exactly that cause. First, to ending slavery in the British Empire, and then campaigning for its end in the rest of the world. And of course, it existed another 25 years here in the United States, and in parts of Latin America still longer.
Incredible. And I think, I mean, you tell it as if you wrote the book last week. But it's this detail about history and the people and the epiphanies that makes it so fascinating. I think you say of Clarkson somewhere that he felt somebody should interfere. He didn't believe that nobody had interfered, and he became the person who interfered in this grand exploitative scheme. I'll just mention in passing, Adam, before I put my next question to you, the poster that you mentioned of the slave ship. And this, again, for me, is a quirk of how the past enters the present. But I don't know if you know, but I think that was the poster that became the cover of Bob Marley's second album.
That's right.
Zimbabwe.
Yep.
So, you know, that's history and life for you. And yet, you know, you write this fascinating book, and in an essay that you have written called Practicing History Without a License, a wonderful essay in your book of called Lessons from a Dark Time. If I can just tell the people who are with us tonight, you write, when I was looking for a publisher for my book on the conquest of the Congo by King Leopold II of Belgium, 9 out of 10 publishers who received the book proposal turned it down. African history, Belgium, forget it. Nobody would be interested. Why? There isn't even an African history shelf in most bookstores. If historians wrote for the public only on subjects with a strong record of popular interest, 90% of all history books would be about the founding fathers, the Civil War, or the Second World War. So there you go. It tells you a lot, and it helps lead into my next question. I'll come back to some of your books in a few minutes, and I'm noticing some people asking some questions, which I'll also come to. But why is history so important? Why do you regard history as being so important? And why do you engage in this particular genre of what you call public history? And how do you distinguish public history from the type of stuff that I didn't learn at school?
Well, sometimes the word public history is used in different ways, at least here in the United States. I don't know how it is in other parts of the world, but sometimes we use the word public history to refer to history that's told not just in books, but in museum exhibits and historic sites and this kind of thing. And I think that's terribly important, because anyway, any means that you can use to dramatize what's happened in the past and its connections to the life of the present is tremendously important. They just opened a new museum of slavery on the very site where slave ships landed in Charleston, South Carolina. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm very eager to do so. The other way in which we use the word public history is people who write about history for normal people and not for other historians. I'm always amazed at how much history is badly written or obscurely written because it's historians writing for other historians. And all too often, the way our university system works here, and again, I'm speaking of the US, it may be a bit better in other countries, is that, you know, you get promoted in your history department from associate professor, assistant professor, associate professor, full professor, on the basis of publishing articles in scholarly journals and books that are published by university presses. These are peer reviewed, which means that you have to put lots and lots of references in what you write to what other historians have written about this particular issue, because one of them may be one of your peer reviewers and you don't want them to feel left out. So this results in a lot of history about very important things being written, but written badly. I am not in the academic world. I never went to graduate school. I do teach part-time in a graduate school, but a graduate school of journalism, not of history. I teach writing. So I don't need to worry about getting promoted up the professorial ranks. And I write for the general public, as you know, many historians have done over the years, and have done over the years before they even invented history departments in universities. So I'm looking for ways to dramatize history by writing first about issues that I feel have some kind of relevance for today. And certainly the story of colonialism in Africa has enormous relevance for a continent which, like most of the world, is still feeling the after effects of that colonialism. So I look for stories that are relevant. I look for stories that I can dramatize through the lives of people who participated in them, who fought for justice in one way or another, or who tried to prevent justice from happening. And the villains are just as much fun to write about as the heroes. I talk about heroes and villains, but of course, unlike novelists, we historians are not allowed to invent anything. So most of my books are extensively footnoted. And if there's a quotation, you know, it says when this person said it or wrote it. Those are the rules that you have to follow.
And I mean, I think you've just said it, but your books are meticulous in their detail, in their referencing. Public history is not any less rigorous than academic history. It's just that the writers of public history pay more attention to its accessibility and relevance to today. There's two lovely essays in your book of essays. One has I think, a beautiful cheeky title, "You Never Know What's Going to Happen Yesterday," which I think is fantastic. And you say in that essay, the longer that I work with the past, the more I realize it's not unchangeable at all, which is, I think, something that we all resonate with, people who rewrite the past for their own purposes. And you have another essay, which I love, called "Practicing History Without a License," where you talk about how history can learn from creative writing. Both of those are in this book, Lessons from a Dark Time. Let me just put one question that has been in the chat so far. There's a number of questions, but whilst we're still on the issue of colonialism and slavery, before I shift topics, Mbongeni Kumalo says, was the end of slavery a result of moral outrage or a calculated thought that it was no longer profitable? I don't know if you have a thought on that. And then Nicholas, I think it's also related. What does Adam think of the mainstream British narrative of the abolitionists being widely supported by society and leadership at the time? In many instances, they were not. Many of the Quakers were seen at the time as religious fanatics, especially. It's just 2 minutes thoughts on those two questions, Adam.
Let me sort of put them together. The mainstream British narrative for, really for nearly 2 centuries was that Britain benevolently decided to grant freedom to the slaves in the 1830s. And you can see engravings from that time of grateful slaves kneeling at the feet of Britannia on her throne with a scepter, benevolently granting them freedom. Well, this was nonsense. 2 things made this change happen. One was this extraordinary, dynamic, popular, quite widespread movement in England, where, thousands and thousands of people turned out, marched through the streets. It combined by the early 1830s with the movement for widening the franchise in Britain, which more and more people were demanding. And, you know, you actually saw people marching through the streets there with signs saying, "End slavery at home and abroad." The other thing that put pressure on the British to make this happen was these enormous slave revolts in the Caribbean that I mentioned earlier. The largest of them in Jamaica, 1831-32, caused 500 deaths. It took the British Army 6 weeks to suppress it. And I think a major thing that pushed Parliament into finally abolishing slavery was that, you know, colonial officials came back to Britain and testified. You know, plantation officials, people from the administrative structure in Jamaica said, these revolts are going to keep on happening and we may not be able to suppress them next time. So I think this is why slavery came to an end, and not because, as another questioner asked, it was unprofitable. It was still very profitable. Same thing, you know, here in the United States, where it took a civil war to end the system that had enslaved at that time 4 million Americans.
Thank you, Adam. Just a very quick question, and I've got a bunch of questions, and don't worry, people, I'm seeing them all. Brendan asked quite early in our conversation, I discovered Adam's work via the commendations of the great late Christopher Hitchens. I was curious, did you ever have occasion to meet Christopher and your views on his work?
I did meet Christopher several times. I'll tell you a very funny Christopher Hitchens story. I live in Berkeley, California, and I had the pleasure of knowing Mario Savio, who was a leader of the student free speech movement at Berkeley in the 1960s. He died in the 1990s, and in his memory, they set up an annual Mario Savio free speech lecture on the Berkeley campus. And I was on the committee that chose a lecturer each year for a couple of years. And in the year 2001, we have to line up the lecture a year in advance because it's a huge event, you know, 1,000 people come and so on. Year 2001, I suggested Christopher Hitchens. In between the time that we invited him in 2001 and the lecture itself, which was the fall of 2002, he had changed his position from being a columnist for The Nation magazine, a longtime liberal voice here in the US, to becoming a columnist for the Weekly Standard, a right-wing voice. And he had begun to beat the drums in a very enthusiastic way for the war that George Bush subsequently launched in Iraq. And this little committee of Berkeley liberals who'd invited him to give this lecture was going crazy. And people were saying, we have to uninvite him. And I said, you can't uninvite somebody that you've invited to give the annual free speech lecture. So by the time the lecture was scheduled, which was the fall of 2002, Hitchens was on the war path, wanting the U.S. to wage war on Iraq. He and I, for being on the committee, were being denounced on the radio in Berkeley, on the left-wing radio station. There were people demonstrating outside. And of course, Hitchens loved this because he was somebody who loved to speak to hostile audiences. And I must say, and I, because it had been my idea to invite him, I was given the job very much against my will to do a question and answer with him on stage. I was very nervous about this. I have to say he handled himself magnificently. I've never seen somebody handle an audience of 1,000 really hostile people who disagreed with his position on something that was very central at that time, whether the U.S. should launch that terrible war in Iraq or not. He handled himself brilliantly. He was somebody who obviously loved dealing with a hostile audience, outraging people. What do I think of him as a journalist? I think he was a brilliant man. He wrote about a wide range of things. He was extraordinarily well read. He was also on-the-ground reporter who went to trouble spots all over the world. I think his enjoyment at outraging people sometimes got in the way of his writing as well as he could have. He was not somebody that you could easily have a discussion with where you try to get at the truth together. He wanted to win arguments. I think that came from his, the tradition of debating societies. I can't remember whether he went to either Oxford or Cambridge, where the important thing is to win over your opponent and not to get to the truth. I am not a debater myself. I would rather explore with somebody I disagree with and see if there's a room for compromise of some sort.
Right. Fascinating. I'm seeing many questions, and I'm probably not going to be able to get to them all because I want to take us through a couple of other of Adam's works, but I'll get to as many as I can. I've also seen somebody asking about American Midnight, and I assure you that in a couple of minutes we're going to talk about Adam's latest book. But Adam, I just, before we leave history and so on, one other question. People may not know, but you've been married for a very long time to globally respected sociologist Ali Russell Hochschild. She's written a very, very famous, I think, award-winning book, amongst many books, Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right, described by the New York Times as one of the 6 books to understanding Trump's win. And knowing that, it just made me think, made me want to know, do you collaborate with Ali? Do you talk your stories through? Does she talk her stories through, her research through? And it made me think of another thing, which is just what is relevant to history, and I think to activism as well. How important is sociology to history? And how important is psychology to history? May seem a little bit strange questions, but if you just give us a few thoughts on that for a few minutes.
Well, let me just shut a window because there's some noise coming. Arlie is on the other side of the door that you can see behind me here, working away hard on her next book. We do collaborate in many ways. We each talk through what we're writing about, every day as we're working on it. I feel I know all of her characters who appear in her book before I meet them, and they're people I actually get to meet because sooner or later I go with her to the places she's been writing about, or they come and visit us. She knows all of my characters, but since my characters are usually 100 or 200 years ago, she doesn't get to meet them, but neither do I. We read each other's manuscripts, many drafts. I read 3 drafts of her last book. She read 2 drafts of my last book. And it's wonderful having somebody who does something similar that you can share the work with and collaborate with. So, yeah, we do work very closely. Her discipline is sociology. But, I don't make rigid borders between disciplines because I think of myself as being mostly a historian at this point in my life, but also a journalist. And sometimes when a chance comes along to go somewhere interesting or to meet somebody interesting, I put my journalist hat back on and get out my notebook and tape recorder and I go off somewhere. And that's what Arlie does for all of her books. She calls it sociology. I call it journalism, but we've each written for some of the same magazines, so I'm not sure there's any rigid barrier between the disciplines there.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. So let's talk about American Midnight. I mentioned it in passing. Its subtitle, The Great War, A Violent Peace and Democracy's Forgotten Crisis. It deals with the years, I think, 1917 to 1921, 1922. It tells part of American history that has in some ways been suppressed or at least buried. And my sense is that you wrote American Midnight with contemporary America in mind, approaching another possible American Midnight. I'd like you to just tell us a little bit about the book, its reception, and why you wrote it.
Well, here's the period covered in the book. I think it's a roughly 4-year period in American life that usually isn't considered as a period to be studied carefully. You know, if you read your normal American high school history textbook, there's a chapter on the First World War, photographs of American soldiers in those sort of wide-brimmed forest ranger hats. They go off to Europe, they fight bravely, they help win the war, then they come home, and then you turn the page, and the next chapter is the Roaring Twenties, jazz, famous baseball players like Babe Ruth, Prohibition in the United States, things like that. What gets left out is a period of 4 years when I think this country suffered the worst political repression since the end of slavery. During this 4-year period, 1917 to 1921, more than 1,000 Americans were sent to prison for a year or more, and a much larger number for shorter periods of time, solely for things that they wrote or said. I don't mean that nobody engaged in political violence during that time. There was that as well. But these are people who were imprisoned for things that they wrote or said. The most famous of them was Eugene Debs, a several times socialist candidate for president, who gave a speech against American participation in the First World War and was sentenced to 10 years in prison because of it. Like many of these political prisoners, he was still behind bars several years after the war ended. And in November of 1920, he received nearly 1 million votes for president on the Socialist Party ticket, while an inmate in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. It was the first time somebody had waged a presidential campaign while behind bars. If we're lucky, that may happen again with Donald Trump next year. We'll see. It was also a period, this 4-year time, when the press censorship took place on a large scale in the US. More than 75 newspapers and magazines were shut down. It was a period of vigilante violence, again on a huge scale, encouraged by the US Department of Justice. Why more people don't write about this time, I do not know. But I see in all of those things, the political repression, the impulse to censorship, tremendous rage against immigrants and refugees, which was also something that runs through this period, a lot of parallels to what we're facing in the US today. I think this was the Trumpiest period of American history before Trump.
Yeah, and a great book. I'd like to talk more about it, but I'm watching the clock and worrying that there's so much to talk about and the time is running out. Adam, you had written another book about the First World War. It's called To End All Wars, the story of protest and patriotism in the First World War. In some ways, I see this almost as a companion piece, an earlier companion piece to American Midnight. Again, beautiful story. The stories of resistance to the First World War are not often told, and you warn in this. If I have a chance, I'll read it. Read a passage at the end. You know, about the fact that this war that was meant to be the war to end all wars has been far from the war to end all wars, which again is very relevant as we sit on the cusp of new wars at this time. There's one question, and I'll combine it with another. Can you share something of your research and writing process? I mean, how long does it take to write these sweeping histories, which are so grand but so granular at the same time? And what makes you think, okay, I'm going to deal with America now? And something else tomorrow?
Well, sometimes a story just grabs hold of you, but it takes a long time to figure out how to focus it. The book that you're holding, To End All Wars, which is basically about the First World War and the resistance to it in Great Britain, took me 6 years to write. The story so fascinated me that I wrote too much. The final book is 140,000 words, which is a not unreasonable length of a book. But the initial draft was 230,000 words. And I made the mistake of giving it to a couple of friends and asking them to read. And some of them are still in treatment after that experience because it was just so long, so overwhelming. That story grabbed hold of me for this reason. The First World War was such a turning point in the 20th century. The historian Simon Schama describes it as the original sin of the 20th century, which I think is a very good definition. It's impossible to imagine the Second World War without the First and the legacy of bitterness and resentment that it left in Germany. And it killed an immense number of people, caused immeasurable suffering, millions of dead, and as I say, laid the groundwork for the Second World War. What most people don't pay enough attention to is that while that First World War was going on, there was resistance to it, outspoken resistance to it, in every one of the belligerent countries. Nowhere was that resistance more vivid than in Britain. One reason, I think, was that Britain was not attacked by Germany at the beginning of the war. You know, France and Belgium were attacked. Russia was attacked, but Britain was not attacked. And many people in Britain, mostly on the left, but not entirely so, felt, why should we involve ourselves in a European war? And I got fascinated by the bravery of those who continued to say this for the next 4 years, by people who refused the draft, by people who went to prison for their beliefs. I struggled for the longest time to figure out how to tell the story, because I didn't want to do just a series of portraits of these boneheaded generals who ordered young men to climb out of the trenches and get mowed down by machine gun fire, and then a series of portraits of the brave pacifists. I couldn't figure out how to tell the story. And then one day I was reading a very boringly written scholarly article about a British woman pacifist named Charlotte Despard, who was an outspoken radical on every issue, you know, favored independence for Ireland, independence for India, went to jail 3 times in the battle for women's suffrage. Then when the First World War came, spoke out against it, held rallies all over Britain. They were, you know, shut down by people throwing rocks or by Scotland Yard. And then one sentence in passing, this scholarly historian said, naturally, Mrs. Despard's activities were deeply upsetting to her brother, Sir John French. And I recognized the name, Sir John French, British commander-in-chief on the Western Front. And I thought, brother and sister, now that's going to be an interesting relationship. And then a couple of hours later, sort of a light bulb went off in my head. Divided families, that's how I'll tell the story. I knew all about divided families because here in the US, you know, the Vietnam War divided parents and children from each other in a very intense way. So that was how I framed the story. It took me a long time to figure that out, but once I did, I think it was a good storytelling device, and it's the history book of mine that I'm most proud of.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book. Adam, do you start thinking about books concurrently? I mean, one of my questions was going to be, are you working on another book at the moment? And a friend of mine wrote to me, knowing your interest in passion in social justice and activism and crucibles of conflict, would Adam write about Palestine? Can you answer those questions quickly? And then I'm going to bring us to a conclusion, talking a little bit about South Africa and your writings and interest in South Africa.
Yeah. I would love to write about Palestine if I could find an original way of telling the story. I have looked for that unsuccessfully because I'm so struck by the paradox that here, you know, the Jews, and I'm half Jewish and I have relatives in Israel who were victims of the Holocaust, you know, have ended up now displacing another people from their land, basically. And I'd love to find a way into that story. I haven't found an original way that someone else has not found already, but I'm looking. What am I working on now? I'm trying to figure out a way to write about the Great Depression era in the United States, because it was a time when the US, like every country in the 1930s, faced a horrible crisis. We had a quite extraordinary president who felt, I'll try everything. I like that spirit. He did some remarkable things. Again, how to find an original way to tell the story that no one else has done so far, that's always a problem. That's what I'm working on right now.
Thank you. Very glad to know that. We've only got 8 minutes left. Before we started, I was wondering how I'd keep this conversation for an hour, and now I can see I could do it for 3 hours, and probably people would be interested. But and one of the people who's with us tonight just reminded me, what about South African dusk? So let's talk about the South African dusk, or whether it's a South African dusk. You have a particular interest in South Africa, Adam. You describe your kind of political initiation to being an intern journalist, I think in 1962. One of your first books was this book, not the first, I think the second or third, The Mirror at Midnight, describing our transition and some of the history that preceded it. And you in your essays, you talk about South Africa as a moral touchstone for the world. Will you just reflect on South Africa for a minute, and also what you from a distance think of what you see is going on in our country?
Well, my own connection was that when I was a university student here, I was 19 years old. I spent a summer working on an anti-apartheid newspaper in South Africa. It was the summer of 1962. I was in the country when Mandela was arrested, the beginning of his 27 plus years in prison. And it was in some ways a life-changing experience for me, because it was the first time I was somewhere where politics was really serious business. It was not just a matter of polite disagreement over a dinner table. It was, you know, what you believed could affect whether you had to spend many years in jail. I got to know people who had spent periods in jail and people who went to jail subsequently. It was also a time when I realized that in the struggle that was then going on in South Africa, the United States was on the wrong side. And that was a huge revelation to me. 1962 was a time, of course, when the civil rights movement was beginning in the United States. Within a year or two after that came our movement against the Vietnam War, in which I was very much involved. But somehow that summer I spent in South Africa was an initiation into serious politics for me. Not that I contributed anything substantial, but that just being around people who were engaged in that long struggle against apartheid was a deeply moving and affecting experience. I've been back to South Africa a number of times since then. I came several times in the 1980s and wrote the book that you held up, The Mirror at Midnight, which was basically based on coming to South Africa in 1988, which was both a peak of anti-apartheid repression. It was when Botha was still prime minister, before de Klerk had come in. You know, tens of thousands of people were being jailed or being murdered by the police. It was also the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Blood River, which was being marked with enormous ceremony, both by the government and by the Afrikaner organizations that were farther to the right of the government. So the book gave me a chance to delve into history, where there are two narrative streams in the book. One of them are the events leading up to the original Battle of Blood River in 1838, which was, of course, the battle that decided whether the Boers or the Zulus were going to run that part of the world. And then the travels around South Africa today, visiting some of the sites that were important 150 years earlier, ending up with a pageant-like reenactment of the Battle of Blood River that was put on by the AWB on the 105th anniversary date. An extraordinary and quite frightening event. I've been back to South Africa a couple of times later. When the first real elections happened in 1994, I put on my journalist's hat and came and covered the elections for the Village Voice in New York City. I think the most interesting time after that was I came back in 2007, and a friend of mine and I spent a week doing narrative writing workshops for journalists, mostly at the independent newspaper chain. So I've visited a few times. I can't, and in no way claim to be expert on what's going on in South Africa today, but of course I keep up with friends, read what I can in the newspaper, am disappointed, like many people all over the world, that everything didn't become, totally wonderful as soon as apartheid ended. But we ought to know enough by now that when any totalitarian system comes to an end, its replacement by something better is not something that happens easily. And I think it's been especially difficult in South Africa because of the enormous, enormous disparities of wealth that have continued just as they were under the apartheid regime. But I celebrate the fact that you've got a society with active civil society organizations, with something like the Daily Maverick, with something like events like we're doing right now. There are all too many parts of the world, Russia, for example, where after a big change, that has come to a stop.
Yeah. And you say, and I think this is applicable to us, and again, this is an insight I think that you draw from your own research and writing and history. Every system of oppression is tenacious and all too often reorganizes itself into something similarly nasty under a different name. And I must say, I like the way you love our country. You haven't mentioned, but I know you took the Mirror at Midnight title from something Albie Sachs wrote. I know
actually from something Brayton Breitenbach wrote.
Breitenbach, sorry, of course. But you met Albie Sachs, I think. Am I right?
Yes, I've met Albie several times. An extraordinary man.
And you see in our constitutional court in Braamfontein in Johannesburg an embodiment of public history. I think you talk about taking public history as taking the bricks of the past and using them to build something solid for the future, which is exactly how our constitutional court was constructed. Look, there's so much. I had wanted to ask you about Russia, because I know that you worked with Memorial, whose former chairperson I interviewed last week. You might want to reflect on that. But I want to finish, feel free to, if you want to, with two questions before I wrap up this webinar. One from Christia Cullinan, who's a writer, historian herself. How do you view the relationship between your writing and the need for activism and social justice? And I can group that with another question. Would it be adequate thought that the overlying theme of your writing is the history of activism, activists in the face of historical events? So perhaps just tying history to the present and what we do, what people should do with the type of things that you bless us with, Adam.
Well, if my writing in any way inspires people to activism, I'm delighted. Sometimes it does in ways that I never would have predicted. For example, we spoke earlier about my book, Bury the Chains, about the British anti-slavery movement. Well, you know, you learn who's reading a book by who invites you to come and talk about it. And for the first 5 or 6 years after the book came out, the invitations that I had to come and talk about the story I told in Bury the Chains were from university classes on African history, on African American history, on social movements, or whatever. The last 5 speaking invitations I've had to talk about that book have come from organizations working to combat climate change. Why? Because I think they saw this story of activists who changed how the world thought about something that everybody took for granted 250 years ago, almost everybody took for granted, as something they can learn from. So that's been a huge thrill for me, to go to a climate action group and tell them about something that happened 200, 250 years ago that they feel has a connection to what they're doing today. The book even got reviewed in a scholarly journal for climate scientists by a Swedish climatologist who said, you may be wondering about why I'm reviewing in our journal a book about slavery in the British Empire 250 years ago. Here's why. So sometimes those connections happen, and it's a delight to me when they do. I can't always predict when it's going to happen. I can't always say what I would like to happen as a result of a book, but I like to feel that a well-told story about people who passionately wanted to change the world for the better in some way will affect other people in a different place and a different time who also want to change the world for the better.
Well, Adam, it affected me. I can tell you that as a social justice activist, and I was introduced to you by another social justice activist. So it's a great way of fueling progressive change based on human rights and social justice for the present. I'm very sorry, and Adam, that our conversation has run out of time. A few minutes over time. We've still got 325 people with us. I must say I'm amazed. When I asked you to do this webinar, I thought, well, maybe we'll have an intimate conversation with 100 people at best. And it's fantastic that so many people are interested in your writing, so many people are interested in history, and so many people have joined us tonight. I want to thank Love Books, who co-hosted this webinar and helped to popularize it. Love Books in Johannesburg. I want to encourage people. Love Books have some Adam Hochschild books, probably not enough to meet the demand. Here in Cape Town and another place, I'm not sure who stocks your books, but go and bang on those bookseller doors, because American Midnight and all the books that we've been talking about are really brilliant, brilliant books. Thanks to the Daily Maverick team, Nicole and Simpiwe, who have helped to put this together. And Adam, as a fan of yours, I'm very grateful we've had this conversation, opportunity for conversation, and I look forward to chatting to you again at some point in future. Good night, everybody, and thank you for participating.
Thank you, Mark. It was a real pleasure.